Good day, ladies and gents. This is Allegory to Zeitgeist with Alex and Byron. Have you ever been enjoying a movie or TV show, reading a great story, or just watching the world roll on by, and found yourself wondering what would happen to all this if? Perhaps you want to sprinkle a little chaos into the mundane, or maybe you're just curious about the minutiae of an extraordinary situation. Of course you've wondered about it. It's natural curiosity. You wouldn't be you if you hadn't, and let's face it, who doesn't like you? Well, in summation, that's pretty much the gist of our show. We'll be delving into the fantastical worlds of superheroes, TV shows and film. We're getting meta about movies and overthinking everything. If you're an intrepid cognitive explorer and that sounds like your barrel of whiskey or your particular brand of weird, then empty out your fun bags and get ready to fill them right back up again with something entirely stranger. Fair warning, we will be talking about all manner of movies and TV shows and everything in between. So there'll be a spoiler warning in effect in perpetuity. Although, in fairness, our references are largely about things that are either so popular or so old that if you're uninformed, then shame on you. Get yourself down to Blockbuster and rent yourself a VHS and you'll be up to date in no time. And now, with all the ado out of the way, let's get straight to our next episode. We are talking about Thanos today, specifically the MCU version and the lineage there within. And we are trying to figure out, did the guy have a point? So, his goal, to get rid of half of all life in the universe. Let's think about that for a second. Not just a planet, not a solar system or a galaxy, the entire universe. So, I mean, props to the guy for dreaming big, because, you know, if you're going to set a goal, why not? Why not take out everybody, or half of everybody? The point is, was what he was doing a noble cause? In Infinity War, you certainly, or I can only speak for myself, but there is certainly an empathy towards him. You sort of feel like he's got a noble goal and he's trying to achieve something, and he's not an all-out villain. There are points in that film where what he's saying really makes sense and sort of strikes a chord. And in the end game, it's a very, very different sort of Thanos. We'll crack on with that at a later point, but for now, Byron, what do you think?
Top level, out of context, he had a point. That's what I would say. Obviously, there's a lot of big context to it, such as, are you one of the blipped? Is your immediate family one of the blipped? Is someone who's important to you one of the blipped? Of course, there's always going to be varying factors. Some people get lucky and others won't. But ultimately, I think on the whole, without thinking too much about all the individual variables, I would say he's ultimately got a point.
See, I'll be inclined to agree with you, but I started thinking the other day, ultimately, even if he does achieve his goal, which in the films obviously he does, it's a band-aid at best. So what he's doing is stemming the tide of inevitability. People are going to grow beyond their means one way or the other. It's what we do. So when we get to a point where you can't feed everybody, you can't care for everyone, home everyone, he's making the argument that by halving everything, that it takes all of that pressure off of your resources and off of your society and civilization, which absolutely it will, but only for a certain amount of time, because the same thing is going to happen again. The people and the species that still exist are going to continue to procreate, and they're going to continue to put stress on their environment. I think it's probably less of a concern. I think we should probably focus on humans and humanoid creatures in the MCU in particular, because things like birds and animals and so on tend to live more harmoniously with their environment. They don't overindulge and kill off their food source and things like that. Human beings in particular absolutely do. We will, kind of like the alien race in Independence Day, find a place, set up shop, drain it of all its resources, move on somewhere else. It's kind of what we do. So that being the case, we will just keep reproducing and using up resources until we're right back where we were when Thanos snapped us all in the first place. The question is, how much time has he bought us? And if he is only buying us time, was there any point in doing it in the first place and going to all that effort and all using all his resources and seeing almost all of the Black Order get killed in the effort to get all the Infinity Stones, only to buy us some time, and ultimately it causes his own demise as well. So that being the case, has he still got a point?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's too many unknowns, but I'd still say, yeah, ultimately, yes. I mean, because obviously it's difficult to predict, of course, how the world would actually look like after this happened. Of course, there's probably many consequences we wouldn't even be able to predict. Ultimately, some will be kind of obvious to us, but then some will be unknown. So it's kind of, you almost need like all the cards laid out in front of you to be able to say, it's not worth it because of this factor or such. So, but on the whole, the theory, I think, holds up, and ultimately the method in which it was done as well. Yeah, that's what I mean. And without too much kind of evidence to kind of prove otherwise, I think I'll have to stick to my guns on that one.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, to quote the big purple dude, it's fair and dispassionate. The method which you just mentioned, I don't think you can reasonably argue that it isn't the most humane way of doing it. If you are going to wipe out billions of people, then snapping them out of existence is the nicest way to do it. So we'll agree on that one and table that for a while. I don't think it really needs revisiting. But let's talk about the Flag Smashers for a minute, because they're very much on the side of Thanos, and that what he did was right. And their basis is nothing to do with him or his ideology. It's to do with them living in the world that he left behind, in that people with nothing now have something, or they have the opportunity to have something which was denied them before, not through lack of effort or lack of willpower or trying or anything like that. And not people sitting around on their hands not doing anything. They were denied opportunities because of where they came from or their standing in the world, and now they have somewhere to live and they have food to eat, and then everybody gets blipped back, and all of a sudden it's taken away from them again. So in Endgame, Steve Rogers comments on how he saw a pod of whales as he was coming over the Hudson, which is notoriously one of the most disgusting rivers in the world, but it's cleaner. And to support that, obviously that's fiction, but in the real world, in the pandemic last year, that exact sort of thing started to happen all over the world. Nature was starting to re-emerge in the absence of mankind. So there's certainly an argument for what he did benefiting people. I suppose it is, like I said, it's only going to be a benefit for a certain amount of time. But if we're going to look at the really big picture, we're only going to be here for a certain amount of time anyway. Our existence is going to be a blip compared to the rest of the universe. So you could potentially take that argument off the table and just look at the more immediate future and the world that snapping everyone's going to leave behind. There's definitely a good argument for it. There's a comparison that you and I talked about before between him and Hitler, in that they both wanted to reshape the world. Thanos wanted to reshape everything, but the goals are similar. Hitler wanted to reshape the world and make it the way he thought it should be, and in doing so, he was going to have to eliminate great swathes of people. The difference, I think, was that one was doing it genuinely because he believed it was for the betterment of everybody, and the other one was doing it because he thought it was for his benefit. It suited the world he wanted to live in and the image of people he wanted to look at. But they were both willing to wipe out great percentages of life to achieve their goals. Would you say they were any more similar than the fact that they were willing to do that? See any more similarities between the two?
Maybe there's. I don't know my history as well as I possibly could, but I suppose it's an attempt at trying to do an alternative first. Neither seemed, to my knowledge, to have thought, is there another way of doing this before I start ending lots of lives in order to achieve my particular goal? Like murder was very quickly an okay thing for them to do. There was no discussions, there was no appeal process, there was no I will reason with you, but just so you know, if things go south, I believe in this cause to this level.
And if anybody knows different, by all means correct us. If I'm not going to, I don't think either of us will make any illusions about that we've read every Marvel comic and what have you, and I think I'm fairly confident if we were taking a pub quiz about history, but I'm not arrogant enough to assume that I know everything about Hitler or World War II. So by all means, if there's an argument to the contrary, love to hear it. But I hadn't thought about that. I think you're probably bang on. It does seem to be that we're in the MCU for a start. We're the only introduction to Thanos. The only bits and pieces we see of him before he really emerges is him trying to collect Infinity Stones, and his end goal is always to use them to eliminate half of all life. I know in the comics that there's a lot more about him, and it was him trying to impress Lady Death and things like that, but specifically in the MCU, that version of Thanos, it really does look like he's leapt to genocide as the first and only option. There's not anything else. It's just, okay, I think the best way to heal all people that need help is to wipe out half of them. That's just right off the top of my head. Sounds like a good plan. Let's go with that. Somebody write that down. I might forget it. It sounds pretty important. So, and Hitler, yeah, I mean, he's got very storied history, but I think hurting people was never off the table for him. So, yeah, they've almost definitely got that in common. But I think the impetus behind what they wanted to do was very, very different. There's certainly parallels to be drawn, but I don't know. I don't know enough about comic books to know who wrote Thanos and why. Maybe there was some inspiration there from history's greatest villains, the likes of Stalin and Hitler and so on. The great characters are often drawn from real scenarios, aren't they? So, although that might not be directly based on somebody like Hitler, there's probably the idealism of that thrown into the character potentially, maybe not even consciously. Maybe there's bits and pieces of, these horrible events taking place throughout history, working their way into great fiction. And it is great fiction. I don't care what anybody says. It just is. Marvel is practically, and DC is practically Shakespearean. Perhaps not always in every movie they put out, but certainly in the stories they tell in comics and so on. But in the MCU in particular, I think they've got everything. They run the gambit. They've got great performances. There's great comedy. There's great action. There's great affection. There's connections and bonds between the characters. There's love. It is Shakespearean. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of content, and it's a lot to fit in. And I think that's probably why they appeal to a very broad spectrum of people. But I also feel like I'm moving off the subject a little bit. So throw something back at me. Give me a question, Brian.
Okay, so one thing I'd kind of considered quite a bit with the blipping situation is how many people, not specifically of course, would have still died post-blip even if they were deemed one of the chosen ones to survive. E.g., like we see at kind of the end of Infinity War with that helicopter that crashes, into a building when Nick Fury kind of gets his message.
Right, okay.
So obviously there's going to be car crashes. There might be you've lost a loved one, and then people might commit suicide afterwards.
There's a consequence. Yeah,
so of course, even if we said, I know it's 50% of all life, so it might not necessarily have been 50% of just humans that get blipped, but how many more people may have died, intentionally or otherwise, as a result of the blip through accidents?
This is something I've heard talked about before, but nobody's got a real convincing argument on it, because I think the problem with it is by all means I'd love to stand corrected on this, but as far as I know, nobody knows exactly what Thanos was thinking when he did the snap. Like, how does it work exactly? Like, is it one of those things where you have to be incredibly specific with your wish? Like in Aladdin, for example, you have to be really specific and detail oriented. Otherwise, you're going to end up with something completely not what you were looking for in the first place. So, what is he thinking in his head when he does that? Or is it simply a case of, I want to wipe out half of all life in the universe? So then, that one act, there is going to be unintended consequences, like, if a pilot gets snapped, that plane's crashing, that's 200 people dead. And maybe they weren't all, maybe all of them were going to survive. Maybe none of them were. Maybe half of them were. Then it starts to get really murky when you think about that. I think, though, it is probably fair to say that more than half died, because all those people, it's the only sensible way to look at it is that the people who were meant to go were the ones that vanished, that were dusted, right? So anybody that died after that was going to survive, and they've died as a result. So it's probably fair to say, long story short, that more than half of all life died ultimately. Plus, there were, people dying in the fight. Some of those people, some of the Avengers disappear, some of the creatures that are from the Black Order that have been sent into Wakanda, some of them disappear. But they were dying anyway. They were all fighting each other. So and who's to say that fighting stopped? We don't see what the rest of that fight on that big field. We see them in the woods fighting Thanos. Who's to say that fighting stopped immediately after Thanos left? He just disappeared on his own and went off to a planet. He didn't go back to his ship. He didn't go back to his army or anything. Who's to say they didn't just keep fighting for days in Wakanda? It's just didn't know what else to do, because those like dog type creature things. Sorry for not knowing the name. Really falling short on the facts in this one, but they looked very animalistic and single-minded in that, you let them off the leash, they kill whatever's in front of them. So who stopped them? That presumably they just kept attacking the people in Wakanda until they killed them all. One side killed the other, But considering Wakanda's still there afterwards, I'm guessing they eventually killed all of those animals. But how long did it take? Were they rounding them up for months afterwards? I suppose in Endgame at the start you do see, with Black Widow trying to get in touch with everybody and see what they're doing, some of the cleanup effort effectively. They're going all over the galaxy trying to figure out how people are, how they're doing, what's happening, and what their status is, and stuff like that. And from a writer's perspective, that's a really good way to keep Captain Marvel out of the situation, because obviously it's the Eagle and the Lord of the Rings, and it's if you bring her in too soon, then the rest of the film doesn't happen. So you've got the big gun. If you don't save her till the end, then you don't get that killer entrance for a start, which you get in Endgame. But also, it's we don't need Iron Man, we don't need Captain America. She's here, so it's let's all go and get some shawarma and let her deal with it. So yeah. I think let's come down on that side of the argument. That more than half the people died. The other preceding, the other remaining 10 minutes of what I said after that, let's just forget it. Let's come down on that. What's next? What's next on the list?
On the list.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that kind of crossed my mind often is an alternative version of how Thanos could have deemed who should be blipped or not, because of course there is the, it's fair, it's even, rich, poor, sick, healthy, etc. It turns down to randomness. It's kind of the roll of the dice ultimately. But of course, in other fiction, there of course are alternative approaches to these things. So I kind of thought we could kind of explore these alternatives and see maybe if there might have been a better one. So a first one, for example, is exempting top priority persons, like what they do in The Purge. So of course you could deem that, the president or Elon Musk or anyone who's deemed important doing good things for the world, or maybe even countries that are doing very well for resource management, which of course is Thanos' bag, he might have deemed them exempt from the blip entirely. Another alternative is asking for volunteers. So those who are sick, depressed, who may want to volunteer because they know ultimately that their death will save someone else ultimately.
Like Hunger Games.
Yeah, that's kind of the next point, but ultimately it's the same thing in terms of volunteering, but you get to decide. So, like when Katniss basically said, "Don't take my sister, take me." If you were to say, "I will be blipped, but in exchange, you will ensure this person is on the other side and they will survive ultimately." Yeah. So you've got that. Or is random truly best? Because ultimately, people may feel better about it knowing that it wasn't that you were deemed inferior or anything.
There were no rules, there was no choice. It just, the choice was made for you. That's always easy, I think, when people are angry about something or grieving about something, it's good to target it at something. But Thanos is gone afterwards, and even if they don't know that he's gone, nobody's ever going to be able to get to him. Not regular people on any planet. They're not going to be able to get to him to, wag their finger and give him a piece of their mind. It's, I think, to say that it was just done randomly. It's almost like the way people react to, the way people of religion react to, like when children get cancer or something like that. It's horrendous. But people of faith tend to almost, on the outside at least, seem to deal with it better than people without, because they go, it's part of God's plan or what have you. That's how they get, they kind of process it. So I think on a large scale, it's probably easier for people to accept it if it was random. But also from a practical point of view, the reason I don't think that works at different approaches is scale, because he's doing this with his. We're knocking on for 8 billion people on this planet now, and there's, I think even in the MCU, we're supposed to be one of the most densely populated planets, but there are still billions of other people, and not just humanoid life forms, but all sorts of life forms, as there will be trillions, and to be able to go through them all, making rules and exemptions and a certain bar that you need to hit to be able to be okay and all that sort of stuff is deeply impractical, but it's just the sheer mass that he needs to tackle. Just saying half of everything. I think the question is, does he put himself into the lottery with everybody else as well? Is he just thinking half of all life? In which case, here's the thing: does wording come into it? Like again with the genie thing, right? If you said that in like a Disney cartoon. For comic effect, the genie would split you in half, It would literally be half of you. Would you be half, like widthways or lengthways, that kind of thing? And in all seriousness, why didn't that happen? Why didn't they just destroy half of all living creatures, and the other half is technically alive, but now it's going to die because it's only got half of itself, in which case 100% of all life in the universe would come to an end. So, serious question: why didn't that happen? Like, it must be linked to like his higher brain function or something like that. His intent, not specifically his wording. That's all I can think. That when he's got the gauntlet on, it's a matter of feeling and thinking, not necessarily the words that you maybe are saying in your head. You know what I mean? Otherwise, I see that to be very problematic, and I mean like problematic in. It would cause issues, not the room at the top of your house with the ghost in it, because that would also be a problematic dad joke. Can't help himself. That wouldn't work. I don't think on scale. If you're trying to get rid of all trillions of creatures and living beings, if you just say half of everything, you're done. And he's had enough of a struggle to get to the point where he's got Eitri to make the gauntlet for him, and then he's got collected up the stones, and now he's finally got them all together. I think when you get to that point, you just want it to be over, let's be done with it and call it half, not sit down with the leaders of each world and try and work out a deal. Okay. Plus, I think if you were going to do that, you'd probably start with getting rid of all the politicians, all the world, most of the world leaders, probably not worth a cop anyway. Let's get rid of all them, take it back to like Saxon times or something, where people traded in commodities and skills and trades and things like that, and you had to be a bit more respectful of one another, otherwise somebody would stab you. So all that sort of happens now. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I'm really starting to come around on his argument, to be honest. it's starting to appeal to me. But on the aspect of it being there being different approaches, I don't think any other approach would be practical on the scale that he's talking about. If you can't micromanage that sort of level, but if it was if you changed the story and he was trying to wipe out half of life on Earth, you could probably take a number of those approaches. But then your story starts to shift in line with something like the Hunger Games, for example. You start to maybe draw too many parallels to other science fiction and things like that throughout the years. So, that's where I stand on that. What do you think? You think he could come up with another way of doing it?
I mean, potentially. It's a difficult one because, of course, his general argument is, of course, it's unbalanced. So it's understanding what, of course, is that balance, because ultimately it's, if you say half of all life, again, assuming, let's say it's 50% of all humans, you could lose a lot of the good ones who have every intent, who may even agree with that and taking active steps to improve the way the world works, in a sense, and, of course, leave behind lots of selfish criminal types who don't sort of understand. So I don't know if there's a way that when you create the thought, when you do the snap, ultimately that you're calling to some higher power to sort it out for you, sort of thing, rather than you having, because of course Thanos isn't going to hover above the sky and go eeny meeny miny mo to every being down on every planet or anything. But ultimately you kind of think there might be like an extra variable he sticks in with his request that says, something that's a liken to the whole worthiness of Mjolnir for Thor and Captain America. Like, is there an element of worthiness to their approach to the world and resource management and thinking of others, and then focus on trying to keep them and do away with the others? Whereas, of course, I know doing the 100% fair issue means he might actually have made matters worse unintentionally due to random chance.
Yeah, what I've started to think recently is that the balance in the world between good and evil is not 50-50. And I don't think if it was 50-50, things would seem dangerously unbalanced, because it occurs to me that you only need if you're it only takes the smallest beam of light to cut through a room full of darkness. They're not equal. They've never been equal. Likewise, you could spend years building something, literally like a building, and then it could be demolished in moments. So destruction and creation, good and evil, they've never been perfectly balanced. They don't hold equal standing in existence. Do you know what I mean? So I think the actual balance is there always being more darkness in the world than there is light, because it takes less light to overwhelm the darkness. So we've talked about with comedy before. I've always thought that comedy is like a torch in a dark room. You can be surrounded by darkness, and it only takes one little click of that torch to cut through all the darkness and for you to be able to find your way back into the light again. So that could be just one joke. It could be one thing, one moment that you've thought of that brightens you and changes your perspective. My point is, you need less good in the world to be able to overcome the evil that exists. It doesn't take as much to overcome bad things. I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm hopelessly optimistic, but that's not been my experience in life, that I'm optimistic. So I think that an actual balanced world is one where there is more bad in it than there is good. I think that's the way we maintain balance. I think if it was 50-50, things would really start to slant, and then it would find balance again by people becoming complacent and becoming annoyed, and small things would turn into big things, and then it would eventually balance again, because, well, it's sort of like Loki in spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen, in I think it was in the first episode of the Loki TV series, he says that
no bad person is ever really bad, and no good person is ever really good. I think that's probably about as fine a point to put on it about humanity as you can make, really. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's that whole argument of is it ever possible to do something in life and it not be deemed selfish?
Yeah.
E.g., you give like money to charity. Are you doing that? Yeah, exactly. So, but that is ultimately, this is probably a little bit of a paradox in the sense where I don't think it's ever really possible to truly identify if that's true or not. Because ultimately, so many things, we might not even know ourselves we're doing it. You kind of give something away believing you'll do it for the right reasons, but then you kind of get that validation, that dopamine afterwards that becomes borderline addictive. And then, is it now that you've been doing it for the right reasons or not? So it's difficult to say that do heroes in, let's say, the MCU do what they do because they love the praise and adoration of being called a hero, or do they truly do it because they truly care for people and they want to protect them and create a better world?
This raises a good point, and you reminded me of something in Endgame where Thanos says to them, you couldn't live with your own failures. It does bring into focus their impetus for continuing the fight, as it were. Why couldn't they just live in the world they were living in and accept that this is the reality now? That there are good things about it. They say it themselves in Endgame. That there are things they point out in the world now that are positive, but they can't let go of all the people who are gone. Is it that they can't let go of them because they failed? They didn't stop him the first time. So that every time they see those stones with all the names on them, they're seeing their own failure, in which case it's their own ego that's driving them to go back after him again and try and secure the Infinity Stones and do the time heist and all that stuff. I mean, Tony Stark, for example, has moved on. He's made something positive out of his life and he's perfectly happy with it and does not want to go back. He can live. He's the only one, actually, that can live with his failure. And he failed just as much as everyone else. And you can see the weight of it in his face when he's sitting there on Titan. It's Titan, isn't it? He battles Thanos on. And the look on his... this is where I come... It's an aside, but this is where I come back to the idea of great performances in the MCU. That when you cast people like Robert Downey Jr. and many, many others they've got, the weight of their skill that they have for the craft, it shows through. You can see the look, to be able to convey, he knows what's at stake when they're having that battle. He knows the full weight of it, and you can see it on him, the look in his eyes when he's sitting there and they've lost a completely broken man. That's not something just any actor from like Coronation Street can portray. You need somebody that really understands the human condition to be able to put them in front of the camera and have them make you feel that. Which is, as I say, it's an aside from what we're talking about, but I think it's worth mentioning. And I think he's probably right. And it's a different Thanos, obviously, that they're fighting in Endgame, which is something I mentioned at the beginning. I think one of the reasons that we look at Thanos differently between those two films is because the Thanos in Endgame is a younger Thanos that has perhaps not suffered through all the toil to get the Infinity Stones. He's still at the beginning of that journey, or he's not nearly as far along it as the other Thanos was. So, that being the case, he's probably not come to terms fully with the complete weight of his decision, and the fact that there's a bit in Infinity War where he says this day exacts a heavy toll when he hears that one of the Black Order has died. So he really understands he's still going to proceed regardless, but you can see him feeling the weight of his decision and his journey, and he has to keep going no matter what, but it's weighing him down every step of the way. And the Thanos in Endgame is unburdened by that. He is purely driven by his goal and his success, and he doesn't seem to appreciate exactly what it is, all the ramifications that we've been talking about of what he wants to do. which is probably why he comes across as a massive knob end. And the one in Infinity War, you sort of you can look at, and we have this conversation because you look at him and think maybe he had a point. You know, he explains to you what it is he wants to achieve and why he wants to achieve it, and you think it doesn't sound like the worst thing in the world. You know, which is maybe that says more about us than it does Thanos. maybe there's the ability for genocide in our future. I'd like to hope not, but you never know. Like I said, no good person is ever really good, so there you go.
Oh, Bradley Cooper said it as well, didn't he, when he was interviewed?
What's that?
Thanos had a point.
Oh, right.
Yeah, it was one of those kind of, I think, BBC radio interviews when he was promoting, I believe it was Infinity War, actually, and he was kind of speaking about it, and he kind of laughed and said, well, yeah, it's hard to kind of argue with the guy because he's kind of got a point. So, you know, obviously that's from one of the cast members playing a character fighting against him. So, yeah, I mean, and we've had conversations with people before where we know they agree with us. We can't say we're in the majority, of course, by any means. And, of course, ultimately, it's still a hypothetical, isn't it? Like, if literally they were about to say on the news, like, it's about to happen, maybe a very different story. You can never truly know. But, of course, it's all hypothetical at the moment because it's a fictional story, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think having the benefit of being able to see the Marvel TV shows that have come out since, and seeing the world that they and in Endgame as well, the world they inhabit, after the snap. I mean, it's really only in Endgame and in a bit of Spider-Man Far From Home that you get to see the in between. You know, you get to see life after the snap, but before the blip. That little bit there. And then they all come back, and you start to see the ramifications of that, and then the TV shows that carries on and stuff. It really does. Obviously, the shows are geared to it, so it does make you think that the people pulling the strings at Marvel probably do think that Thanos had a point, that the world would be better off if we scale back like that. But I don't think anybody would argue that the world wouldn't be better off, and we wouldn't be better off as a race if there were half of us. You know, if they were closer to 4 billion than closer to 8 billion. It's what the real moral dilemma is: the cost, the human cost to get to that number. You know, you've just got to eliminate half of all people, half of all animals and things like that. I mean, personally, I'll probably keep all the animals and get rid of all the people who like to go around cutting the horns off animals and various things like that. But that comes back to your thing about what kind of people are we going to get rid of. And I think if you're doing it on a planetary scale instead of a universal scale, you can have those discussions. But it's just that, as I say that, it makes me chuckle because I'm thinking very seriously about how you would go about getting rid of half of all people, you know, like we might actually be able to do it. And I'm weighing it up and I'm thinking, well, I've got a family, I don't want them going. But, you know, my neighbours maybe, they could, let's get rid of my neighbours because they're really loud and annoying. and to get rid of the people that like to get dogs to fight each other and that like to batter whales and things like that. I think Ricky Gervais would probably have a very long list of people. We could probably start with just emailing him or tweeting him and asking him for his list of who should go, and then not looking into it in any more detail, because if you start looking into it, you'll probably find out these people have families and stuff, and then you start to feel for them, and you can't do that. And that comes back to the whole, it has to be random, because otherwise it becomes far too messy and you'd never actually achieve your goal. You'd spend eternity wading through the minutiae. So, yeah, and I don't really know what my point was to this diatribe. I started talking, and then it just carried on. So I'm gonna need you to interrupt me, because otherwise I'm just gonna sit here saying words.
Well, I think with the whole selection process, you could. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to literally assess every single unique individual human, or maybe even every living thing.
Can we get rid of vegans? Can we just say as a collective, let's get rid of vegans? Let's do that.
Oh, again, they could make it easier ultimately, I suppose, to do it that way, because it's just a category now, isn't it? Rather than, again, individual assessment is not really the way to go, is it, ultimately?
No.
But even if you literally deemed, I don't know, 100 standout people that absolutely must remain, and then 100 absolute arseholes who clearly should not be alive for whatever reason.
But who gets to choose?
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. This could even become kind of a...
Because you'll never, if you put it up for a vote, like a global vote, you will never find one single person that everyone will agree on. You might get,
of course, yeah.
You maybe get an acceptable margin of error, like 70-30 or something like that, but you will never get in the 90s in terms of percentages of people that agree that this person is wonderful and definitely needs to be saved. There will always be a counterpoint.
Of course, that's kind of coming into a meritocracy kind of version of it. So rather than democracy, of course, because then you've got to take into account the votes and opinions of people who possibly shouldn't even have that vote or opinion because maybe they're not educated to understand who could benefit the world and things like that. Whereas obviously with a meritocracy, you can literally say, right, let's look at who's actually doing something that's going to benefit the world right now, and then literally they become the small pool of people that can, vote and as such. But as long as people don't just say, I vote for my granddad because he's really, really nice, then you can't quite...
Gives me Werther's Originals and I like them.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose there are those middle ground tax. It doesn't have to be a universal 100% fair, or even we're going to assess individual people on a per person basis, and if they make the cut, very much like Hitler style.
Yes.
But there are those middle grounds, I suppose, that could have been entertained as an option, or maybe even were. Maybe they just didn't show that in the MCU. That they're all around a big board table having discussions about this,
maybe.
And it just never worked out.
Well,
so they just showed us.
Thanos struck me as the sort of geezer that had advisors. He had a really big ship in that throne room he's in. It's massive. There's probably some remote chairs that come up from the ground or something. Like them pop-up plugs that you get on worktops these days. And there's some advisors whose job it is to just sit there and wait until he needs to talk to them about something. And they come up midway through their sub for lunch or something like that, and they're like, oh crap, quickly pay the delivery driver, and they're like, right, what do you need? And then he throws it to them, listens to everything, and then ultimately decides he's going to do whatever he wants anyway because he's in charge. So, which is typically how I think a democracy works. You spend most of the time trying to justify the decision you're going to make so that it goes over as positively as it possibly can. You're trying to, the whole argument, the whole debate process is, right, how can I get most people to accept that this is what I'm going to do? Not should I do it? Is this the best thing to do? Already decided. But if you're in charge of a huge number of people, is that a good approach to take, potentially? I think most people on the face of it say no, but really think about it. This is exactly what we've been talking about. If you think about the ins and outs of every single human being and every way in which your decisions are going to affect their lives, you would never make a decision. Nothing would ever change, things would stagnate, nothing would get done. And then ultimately these people's lives would get worse. You have to have a certain amount of detachment, I think, to make big decisions like that. Do we wipe out half of all life? Do I put a new lane on the M25? Those kind of different scale, but you're still making decisions that affect huge numbers of people. And I think you've got to have a certain healthy detachment when making those decisions. You have to accept that what you're going to do is going to affect real living people and their lives. But I think that's kind of where it has to end. Personally, I think that's where it has to end. Otherwise, you'd never bring yourself to make a decision because the weight of everybody's stories would crush you. Well, if I do that, then that means 87-year-old Sally, who raised her niece when her parents died in a car accident, has to move her house. And she's lived there all her life, and it was her parents' house. When you start getting into all of that, you're like, oh my God, that's heartbreaking. Well, I can't do that. But if I don't do this, then we can't expand our transit network, and then that means we lose out on thousands of new jobs. And Dave, he's been on the dole for the last 10 years, and he needs a job, and he's got nothing to do, and his mental health suffering. And do you know what I mean? You can't think about all those branches, and that's real world scenarios. But it's the same with a huge decision in a fictional fantasy world like Marvel, because if you thought about all that, Thanos never would have done anything. It'd have been like, oh Jesus, there's like literally trillions of people who are like telling me why they need to still be alive. It's too much. Let's just snap all of them away and start all over again. I think I'd be inclined to do that just because it'd be overwhelming, kind of like he does in Endgame, but for very different reasons. He sees them as, like, funnily enough, like he does in the first Avengers film, unruly. You know, like they're never going. They're always going to rebel. Whatever you tell them to do, they're going to do the opposite. So let's wipe them all out and start again, clean slate. I'd be inclined to do the same thing, but more for the reasons that this is just far too overwhelming to trying to figure out who I should get rid of and who I shouldn't. Let's get rid of everybody, and probably including myself, and just let life start all over again and see what happens. It's a crazy world we live in, Byron. Crazy. Madness. What's next on the list, Byron? Throw me something. We got anything left?
Yeah, plus sides
Okay.
of this happening, or at least major differences that would occur in our real world if this happened to us. So certain things you can kind of that come to mind, such as, would everyone have had funerals for the people who blipped, even without bodies? So would, like, you know, funeral homes business go through the roof, like from them actually doing these things? And then you kind of think of other things, such as the housing shortage wouldn't be an issue anymore. Potentially job shortage is not an issue anymore. So there'd be a lot of positives.
I think there'd be a lot of positives for the natural world, both from a point of for animals and birds and so on, but for you know, like plants and vegetation and things like that. Obviously, food and running out of fossil fuels and things like that. All it would buy in our immediate scenario, the real world that we're in right now, it would afford us the time to be able to more comfortably transition to long-term energy solutions, you know, from out of our existing ways into things that are going to be much more practical for the long term, not relying on fossil fuels, and people wouldn't have to be starving and things like that. But I guess you could always make the argument that there has probably always been enough food to go around everybody in the world, and yet there are still people in various parts of the world that starve to death every day. You know, and not to get too heavy-handed with it, but it just occurs to me that I saw I couldn't cite my source, but I saw a documentary some years ago that said outright there is you could build a solar array in the North African desert that would provide enough power to power Europe every day consistently, because it gets so much sun and there's so much space. It would be the size of a small city. It would be huge. The only logistical problem would be getting that power to everybody, but theoretically you could do that, and that's an entire continent powered by the sun, you know, and this was years ago. So it does make you wonder, are our problems down to our numbers, or are our problems down to our allocation of resources? You know, is that the biggest issue? In which case, that's a choice that people make, because ultimately people are selfish. I want more than the person next to me. I don't need to justify why. I want more than them, and I'm going to get more than them, and that's the end of it. And I think that's a base motivation for what keeps people. I think we need that as human beings to evolve, to progress. You need to always want more and not to be satisfied. But the downside to that is the world that we've created around us. You know, we destroy ourselves and our environment because we're constantly pushing forward to the next thing. You know, it's in our nature to keep moving on. So benefits to scaling everybody back, it sort of brings on our very nature into stark contrast and into focus, and it would alleviate a lot of the problems, the media issues that we've brought onto ourselves right now. It buys us time to be able to pivot in a different direction. And I said that and I started thinking of Ross, and now I lost my train of thought. Yeah, it does. It gives us the opportunity to pivot. And for years now, no one can say that word without laughing. It's all his fault. But to move into something different, that's the crux of what I'm getting at. It would give us the time. That would be the biggest benefit, I think. Give us time to be able to adjust and start looking at, because the biggest problems that affect us right now suddenly wouldn't be there, or they wouldn't be the biggest problem anymore. There'd still be a problem, but they wouldn't be top of the agenda. So it gives us the opportunity to dedicate more time to other things, potentially. But then what if you've lost a huge amount of your science and engineering sector globally, in the snap? You can't suddenly dedicate all those resources because there just aren't any people that know how to do the things that you're asking them to do. Or what if you lost a lot of your healthcare workers? Or, what if one sector has been hit more than another? Is it even? It's not going to be even. I mean, the odds of it being evenly split down the job sector are astronomical because it's random. And although technically it being random, that could happen, that mathematically that could happen, it could split that way, it is highly unlikely that that's going to happen. So, but benefits for you, what do you think? In our immediate world, how would it benefit us?
Yeah, I suppose it is. I suppose context for starters, because that's one of the typical things is that the world. I mean, we know it within ourselves ultimately, if we're honest, but we take a lot of these sort of things for granted. But then imagine that kind of like fire that might kind of be stoked inside you, that you were chosen to remain, so make it count. And then ultimately, that thing where you kind of like keep putting things off, the things you always wanted to do. Now suddenly it becomes you owe it to those that got blipped to make every effort within your life. So you kind of imagine there might be a lot of people that will make a huge effort to create a better world, live the life they want to live, not just be almost like a dormant spectator of the world anymore. So I believe that will be a huge plus ultimately, apart from people who are still upset about the whole blip, obviously, much like the remaining Avengers were, kind of ultimately a little bit depressive at the start of Endgame, really, weren't they? So, you're going to have a lot of people, I imagine, which I really wish they would have showed a little bit more in the show, which is people who really, see that value in life and the fact that, chance gave them that ability to continue on, whilst others, kind of weren't so lucky ultimately. And, how would that then create a better world with all these people that you would hope would all rally together, not necessarily be at each other's throats fighting for some new opportunities that may have emerged, but you'd like to think the world would then pull together and say, look, we're now missing this, we've lost some of these geniuses in these fields, we need to get people to retrain to their level, etc., and kind of really upskill the world to the point where the quality of life does become good and manageable, and ultimately becomes a world that almost like Thanos wouldn't, I don't know if he's immortal or anything like that, but he wouldn't come back in 1,000 years and say, you've done it again, I need to realign things once again because you've reverted back to your old ways, and population goes out of control again, resources balance out.
He wouldn't be able to, would he, because the Infinity Stones would be burned out.
So, even if not by force, just turning up saying I rule your world now because I'll kill you if not, or whatever. But I don't know. He would make some attempt.
I should probably correct myself on that. They wouldn't be burned out. He wouldn't be able to physically do it, and the Gauntlet would be burned out. The Infinity Stones don't burn out, do they? But that just occurred to me as I was saying that I got that the wrong way around. I think. I think the MCU probably think the same as you, because the Flag Smashers sort of, at the beginning, before they become militant and like terrorists, they embody that idea that there's no borders or boundaries anymore. There's no flags anymore. There's no different countries. We're all people of one Earth, and that's a lovely ideal. It's something that people of our generation, I think more than others, were raised thinking, being told all the time that was the way the world should be. We should see people for people. We should believe believe the content of what people do with their lives and the character within, rather than what you see without, what language they speak or what colour they are and what have you, they go to bed with, and ultimately none of that really matters. But if they're a good person or a bad person, there's a word I like to use quite a lot, which I'm not going to use for this because Byron will have to cut it out, but he knows exactly what I'm talking about. But you either get people tend to either behave in a good way or they behave like a word that begins with C. So that tends to be my experience in the world. It'd be nice to see people bonding together. I worry though that people would, that kind of thing, that you see a little bit of what you just mentioned from Falcon and the Winter Soldier with the Falcon, him being grateful for not ready to take up the weight of being Captain America, but being grateful that he was asked and it was passed to him, and that Steve's not around anymore, and he feels the weight of that he needs to carry on working, he needs to try harder, he needs to better himself, and that in that same way, I was left behind, therefore I need to make the most of it. You see bits and pieces of that without him directly coming out and saying it, but and obviously ultimately he comes to terms with it and accepts it, and then tells the powers that be to do better. But that's the point I was going to get to. If huge groups of people started to take up that sort of Tony Robbins type motivation, it would be great and productive, and to the point where they do what people always do when they feel that they're doing something really good and other people aren't, and they become pious and turn on other people and in judgment, well, you should really be doing this too. Why are you sitting on your couch watching TV? You should be out with us doing good things and making more of your life and stuff like that. And there's not one right way in life for every person, is there? There's different strokes for different folks. So I would worry that would be great for a time, up to the point where there would be a sect of that kind of group of people who decided that everybody needs to be doing what they're doing, because that's happened throughout history. That's still happening now. No matter what when we were kids, it would have been Jehovah's Witnesses. Hundreds of years ago, it would have been the Catholic Church. Now it seems to be vegans. There will always be a whatever the craze or the fad is, or the religion or what have you, there will always be a group of people that think what they're doing is better than what other people aren't doing, and it's their responsibility to tell them what they're doing wrong. And there is one surefire thing in the world that will aggravate people more than most other things, and that's telling them why the way they're living their life is wrong. It's surely going to stir people up. And then you end up with people in that MCU environment perhaps not recognising borders anymore or countries, and not hating each other because of their religion or where they're from and all that age-old stuff. Just hating each other because of their different ideals. And they still end up hating each other one way or the other and fighting each other. I think it's almost inescapable. I think it's something that's just sort of deep inside us that we can't get rid of. And one way I'd love to think that we could sort of live in this utopia, but I think it's more in our nature to sort of end up ultimately building our own little Orwellian nightmare where there's different sects of people, and some people have the power and the masses have none, and we either accept it or we rise up, and it's one or the other. I feel like I'm bringing the tone down a bit, but that's just think it's inescapable. There's just something inherent in us that makes us keep repeating that loop over and over again. It's like one of those sci-fi films where like Memento, where you trying to really desperately to figure something out, and then you get to that point in the film where you realise this isn't the first time you've done this. You've done it over and over and over again. Or like, got to come onto the MCU, it happens in one of the episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., not MCU, but Marvel characters. It happens in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where they keep dying over and over again, and they get less time each time round. They go in a loop, and I think there's probably a reason that sci-fi shows do that kind of episode, because it seems to. I'll go off topic for a moment, but that seems to happen in all popular long-running sci-fi shows. In Stargate, Star Trek, they all do that kind of stuff. Eventually, they'll do an episode where they're in a loop. They're always really entertaining. They're usually some of the best episodes they ever do, because they can do anything. All bets are off. So if you wanted to see two of the main characters get together, now the writers can make that happen, because they don't have to write anything else after it, because the loop's going to reset. Or if you want to see so-and-so punch their boss, or just kill him, for example, or quit, you can do anything. You can do whatever you like, and there's no rules. But they're also entertaining because they make you think about stuff. They sort of hold a magnifying glass over the human condition and make you question stuff, because you're just doomed to repeat your own failure over and over again. And isn't that a famous Einstein quote? The definition of insanity is repeating the same act over and over again, expecting a different result. And it would drive you to insanity. So the only respite that these people in these shows and films usually have is that at the least at the beginning, they don't know they're repeating the same thing over and over again. And perhaps that's why we managed to go on as a race, because if we knew we were just repeating the same history over and over, why would we bother? We'd become like pandas. People would stop mating. They would just give up. Maybe we wouldn't stop mating. It's quite an enjoyable process. I'm not sure people would give up on that. That's probably a bit... I retract that statement. I think people would probably carry on doing that. I'm not sure they'd do much else, though. They would probably just, stay indoors. You know what? We had a glimpse of it last year. It's pandemic life. That's what would happen. People would just stay in, watch Netflix, and mate, for lack of a more PC term that I could think of.
But anyway, I feel we have reached a fork in the road at the end of our considerable ramble. So I think it's fair to say in summation that our answer to the question, did Thanos have a point, was yes. Yes, he did. You said it right from the off, and we spent about an hour diligently circling the drain only to come back to exactly the same point. So yes, he did have a point. However, that point comes at the cost of considerable loss of life. So I guess it depends on how you feel about that. Whether you've agreed with us or not, feel free to evacuate your emotional baggage in the comments section. Hammer that like button as if you were Thor doing a home renovation. And if you subscribe, there is a slight possibility that your life will instantly go all the way up to 11. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.